Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're looking at temporary resident permits in Canada.
TRP is always an interesting topic.
Yeah, and for this deep dive, we're going straight to the source, the Government of Canada website. All the official guides, backgrounders, that kind of thing.
Perfect.
So, to start, can you give us like a quick overview of what a TRP actually is?
Sure. You know, in the simplest terms, it's a document that lets someone come into Canada or stay here temporarily,
Okay, temporarily.
even if they don't meet the regular requirements to immigrate.
So it's like a special pass.
You could say that it's like an exception to the rules.
Okay, so like someone who wouldn't normally be allowed in.
Exactly. You know, maybe they have a past criminal conviction, or they don't meet the income requirements for a visa.
Interesting. But they still need to be in Canada for some reason.
Yeah, there has to be a compelling reason.
A good reason, okay.
And that's where it gets kind of tricky because Canada has all these different commitments, right? Social commitments, humanitarian commitments, economic commitments. And sometimes those commitments conflict with their need to protect Canadians, their health and safety.
So it's a balancing act.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
like trying to weigh all these different factors and decide what's in the best interest of everyone.
That makes sense. So TRPs are like a way to navigate these situations when things don't fit neatly into the usual immigration boxes.
Exactly. It's like, how do we uphold our values as a country while also keeping Canadians safe? And a TRP is one tool that lets them do that.
Okay, so let's get into some specific examples, like who might actually need a TRP? You mentioned someone with a criminal conviction. What if they've completely turned their life around, but they're still inadmissible?
That's definitely a situation where a TRP could come into play. You know, it's all about rehabilitation. If someone has demonstrably changed, a TRP could give them a second chance.
I see. What about something more urgent, like a medical situation?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think of a world-renowned surgeon who's needed for a life-saving operation in Canada.
Right. They have the skills, but maybe not the usual qualifications for a work visa.
Right, so a TRP could allow them to come in and perform the surgery.
Wow, that's actually really cool. Makes you wonder, though, who gets to decide all this? Who has the power to grant or deny a TRP?
That's a great question. It ultimately comes down to designated officers within Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, IRCC.
IRCC, right?
Yeah, they have the authority to review applications and make those decisions.
I imagine those decisions must be incredibly tough.
For sure. There's a lot of responsibility there. They have to consider so many factors, the applicant's background, the reason they need a TRP, the potential risks, the potential benefits to Canada.
And there's no room for appeal.
Yeah.
Like, what if someone feels like the decision was unfair?
Well, there are some avenues for judicial review, but it's a very complex process.
Okay, so not a simple fix.
No, not at all. And it's important to remember that a TRP is not a guarantee. It can be revoked at any time.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, if the officer believes that the conditions of the TRP are no longer being met, or if there's a change in circumstances, they can revoke it.
So it's not a permanent solution. It's more like a temporary reprieve.
You got it. A temporary chance to be in Canada, but with a lot of strings attached.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of strings attached, one thing the guides emphasize is that the TRP holder has to actively work towards resolving whatever issue led to them needing the TRP in the first place.
Right, they can't just ignore the problem. They have to be making genuine efforts to address it. You know, if it's a criminal conviction, maybe they're doing community service or counseling. If it's a financial issue, maybe they're working towards getting a better job.
It's like they're being given a chance to prove themselves, to show that they deserve to be in Canada.
Exactly. And it's not an easy process, that's for sure.
Huh.
But it's definitely a lifeline for some people.
You mentioned earlier that not everyone is eligible for a TRP. Like there's this category called designated foreign nationals.
Yeah, those are folks who are inadmissible to Canada for some pretty serious reasons.
Okay, like what kind of reasons?
We're talking national security concerns, war crimes, involvement in organized crime, terrorism, things like that.
So these are people who are considered a real threat to Canada's safety.
Pretty much, yeah. And they're barred from even applying for a TRP for a certain period of time, usually 5 years.
5 years, wow. Okay, so we've talked about inadmissibility, but there's another category of people who might need a TRP, right? People who have broken the rules somehow.
Absolutely. That's what we call noncompliance. It's when someone has violated the terms of their visa or their stay in Canada.
Okay, so give me some examples. What would that look like?
It could be overstaying a visa, like someone comes to Canada as a visitor, but they stay longer than they're allowed.
Gotcha.
Or it could be working without a work permit.
Ah, I see. So they're here legally, but they're not following the specific rules of their visa.
Exactly. And those violations can lead to inadmissibility.
So even if someone didn't start out as inadmissible, they can become inadmissible later on?
That's right. And that's why they might need a TRP to fix the situation.
Wow. Seems like this whole TRP system can be pretty complicated.
It definitely has its complexities, but it's an important part of Canada's immigration system. It allows for some flexibility, some compassion in cases where the usual rules might not be appropriate.
I can definitely see that. It's like trying to balance the need for rules with the need for fairness.
Exactly. And it's not always easy to find that balance, but that's what TRPs are all about, trying to find solutions in those tricky situations.
Absolutely. So let's say someone finds themselves in a situation where they need a TRP. What's the first step? How do they even begin to tackle this whole process?
Well, the Government of Canada website is a great place to start.
That makes sense.
They have tons of information online, including detailed guides on how to apply for a TRP.
But it still sounds daunting, like sifting through all that paperwork, especially when you're already dealing with the stress of being inadmissible or non-compliant.
I totally get it. It can definitely feel overwhelming. And that's why it's so important to really understand the requirements and gather all the necessary documentation before you even start filling out the forms.
So don't just jump in head first.
Definitely not. Take your time, do your research, and make sure you have everything in order.
The guides mention specific forms and supporting documents. Is there anything that stands out as particularly important?
Well, one thing that jumped out at me is that they really emphasize using a courier service for mailing your application.
A courier, not just regular mail.
Right. Apparently, there have been some disruptions with Canada Post lately, so they're recommending using a courier to ensure your application arrives safely and on time.
Interesting. It's like they're trying to make the process as smooth as possible.
Exactly. They even have specific instructions for certain categories of applicants, like victims of human trafficking or family violence. They have different forms and different mailing addresses.
Oh, wow. So it's really tailored to different situations.
It is. They're trying to be as thorough as possible, and that includes addressing those unique circumstances.
It's good to know that they're taking those things into consideration. Another thing they stress is the importance of being truthful and accurate in your application.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. Any false statement on your application can have serious consequences.
It makes sense. I mean, they're scrutinizing these applications very carefully, right?
Absolutely. They're looking for any red flags, any inconsistencies. They want to be sure that the information you're providing is accurate and complete.
And the officers who review these applications, they're trained to spot those inconsistencies, right?
Right. They're like detectives in a way. They'll compare your application with other records, they'll conduct interviews, they'll really dig deep to make sure everything adds up.
So it's not just about filling out the forms correctly. It's about making sure your story is consistent and credible.
Exactly. Because ultimately, they're trying to assess your character. They want to know if you're trustworthy, if you're genuinely committed to following the rules.
It sounds like a pretty intense process.
It definitely can be. But for someone who's inadmissible or non-compliant, it might be their only option. And that's why it's so important to take it seriously and do everything you can to make a strong case.
You mentioned earlier that the officer has to provide detailed notes to justify their decision. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So basically, whenever a decision is made on a TRP application, the officer has to document their reasoning. They have to explain why they approved or denied the application, what factors they considered, what evidence they reviewed.
So it's all about transparency, making sure there's a clear record of how these decisions are made.
Precisely. It's about accountability. They want to be able to show that the decision was made fairly and impartially based on the evidence and the law.
That makes sense. Because these decisions can have a huge impact on people's lives, right?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have that level of scrutiny, to ensure that the process is fair and that everyone is treated equally.
This has been a fascinating overview of the TRP process. We've talked about the eligibility criteria, the application process, the decision-making factors, and the importance of transparency and accountability. It's clear that this is a complex and nuanced system with a lot of moving parts.
And each case is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right. But hopefully, this deep dive has given our listener a better understanding of the TRP process and what to expect if they ever find themselves in a situation where they need one. Now let's talk about what happens after someone gets a TRP. What are the rules, the restrictions?
That's a great question, and that's what we're going to cover next.
Absolutely. We'll be right back after this short break. Okay, so we've talked about what TRPs are and who might need one. But let's say someone actually gets approved. What happens then? What can they expect?
Well, first off, they have to understand that a TRP doesn't wipe away the reasons why they needed it in the first place.
Right, they're still inadmissible or non-compliant.
Exactly. So while the TRP lets them stay in Canada temporarily, they still have to address those underlying issues. And they also have to follow all the conditions that are attached to the TRP.
Okay, so let's talk about those conditions. What kind of rules are we talking about here?
Well, the most basic one is obviously obeying the law. A TRP holder can't get into any trouble with the police.
Makes sense.
They also can't work or study without the proper permits. Even though they're allowed to be in Canada, they still need authorization for those specific activities.
So it's not like a free pass to do whatever they want.
Nope, not at all. The TRP outlines very specific terms and conditions, and if they violate those terms, their TRP could be revoked.
So let's go back to our examples from earlier. Remember that skilled professional who got a TRP to work on a special project?
Right, the surgeon.
Yeah. So they'd be allowed to work, but only within the confines of that specific project. No moonlighting or taking on other jobs.
Exactly. Their TRP would lay out the exact parameters of their work authorization, and they'd have to stick to it. No going beyond those limits.
And what about someone who got a TRP for medical reasons? Would there be specific conditions for them as well?
Oh, absolutely. Their TRP might require them to undergo certain medical treatments.
To prove that they're actually addressing their health issues?
Exactly. Or it might require them to provide regular updates on their condition to immigration officials. Or it could even stipulate that they need a certain level of financial support to cover their medical expenses, to ensure they're not becoming a burden on the Canadian healthcare system.
It's like they're constantly being monitored.
In a way, yes. It's all about making sure that they're fulfilling the purpose of their TRP.
And one thing that surprised me in the guides is that a TRP doesn't automatically allow you to travel freely in and out of Canada.
Ah, yes, the re-entry rule. That one trips a lot of people up.
You'd think that if you have permission to be in Canada, you could come and go as you please, but it's not that simple.
Nope. A TRP is usually only good for a single entry into Canada. So if a TRP holder leaves the country, even for a short trip, they need to get special authorization to come back in.
Even if their TRP is still valid.
Even then, it's like starting the whole process over again. They have to prove that they still meet the requirements, that they haven't done anything to jeopardize their status.
So it's not just a matter of getting the TRP and then you're good to go.
Yeah.
It's a much more precarious situation than that.
Definitely. They're essentially tied to Canada for the duration of their TRP, and they have to be very careful about any travel plans.
So, okay, let's say someone manages to navigate all of this. They follow the rules. They address the reasons for their inadmissibility. What happens next? Can they eventually apply for a more permanent status in Canada?
It's possible, but it really depends on their individual circumstances. There's no guarantee.
So just having a TRP doesn't automatically pave the way for permanent residency or anything like that?
Not exactly, but there are some pathways that might be open to them. One option is to apply for a regular work permit or a study permit once they've resolved the issues that made them inadmissible.
So they'd have to go through the normal application process, just like anyone else.
Exactly. They'd have to meet all the usual requirements. Having a TRP might show that they're serious about staying in Canada, but it doesn't give them any special advantages.
I see. But there's also this other pathway that's specifically for TRP holders, right? The permit holder class.
You got it. This is a route to permanent residency for certain TRP holders who've been living in Canada continuously for a specific period. Usually it's around 3 to 5 years, depending on the reasons for their inadmissibility.
Wow, so it is possible to go from a TRP to permanent residency. But it sounds like it's a pretty long and complicated process.
It is. And it's important to remember that continuous residence is key. If they leave Canada during that time, even for a short visit, it could reset the clock and make them ineligible.
So there's a lot of pressure to stay put and not rock the boat.
Definitely. And it highlights the precarious nature of their situation. Even if they're doing everything right, there's always that uncertainty hanging over them. The possibility that their TRP could be revoked or that they might not be approved for permanent residency in the end.
It's like walking a tightrope. Every decision they make carries a lot of weight.
That's a great analogy because every step of the way they're being evaluated. Their actions, their choices, their commitment to Canada, it all plays a role.
We've covered a lot of ground here. the conditions of a TRP, the restrictions on travel, the possibility of transitioning to a more permanent status. But one thing I'm still curious about is the decision-making process itself. What are the factors that immigration officers consider when they're deciding whether to grant a TRP?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll delve into after a quick break.
All right, so we've talked about the TRP process, the conditions, the possibilities, but what about the people making these decisions? What are immigration officers actually looking for when they review these applications?
Well, the guides actually give us some insights into that. They emphasize that it's not just a simple checklist. Officers consider a whole range of factors when they're assessing a TRP application.
So it's not like, oh, you check these boxes, you're in, you don't, you're out.
Nope, it's much more nuanced than that. One of the key things they look at is the applicant's history, their past immigration record, any previous interactions with Canadian authorities, that sort of thing.
So they're trying to get a sense of the person's overall track record.
Exactly. Have they followed the rules in the past? Have they ever been removed from Canada? Have they had any run-ins with the law?
It makes sense. You want to know if this is an isolated incident or there's a pattern of behavior.
Right. And speaking of patterns, the guides also really stress the importance of credibility.
Credibility, okay.
Like, officers are trained to spot inconsistencies in an applicant's story. They'll compare the application with other records. They might conduct interviews. They'll really dig into the details to make sure everything adds up.
So it's crucial to be completely honest and upfront throughout the whole process. Even a small discrepancy could raise red flags.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about catching people in lies. It's also about understanding their intentions. Why do they want to be in Canada? Are they genuinely committed to resolving the issues that made them inadmissible?
So it's almost like a character judgment. Like they're trying to gauge the person's sincerity and their commitment to following the rules.
Yeah, you're getting the idea. And it goes beyond just the individual applicant. The guides also mention something called potential for controversy.
Controversy.
Yeah, basically it means that officers consider whether granting a TRP to this particular person might spark public debate or backlash. Is there something about their case or their background that might be seen as sensitive or controversial?
Wow, so someone's public profile could actually influence the decision.
It can be a factor, yeah. They're weighing the potential risks and benefits, not just to the individual, but to Canada as a whole.
It all goes back to that balancing act we talked about.
Exactly. And of course, they also look at more practical matters. The applicant's financial situation, can they support themselves? Are they likely to need social assistance?
It's all about ensuring that they can integrate into Canadian society without becoming a burden on the system.
Right. It's about finding people who are going to contribute positively to Canada.
And one thing that really stood out to me in the guides is the emphasis on documentation. Like, officers are required to provide detailed notes to justify their decisions.
Yeah, that's really important. With these kinds of decisions that can have a huge impact on people's lives, transparency and accountability are absolutely crucial.
It makes you realize the weight of these decisions. It's not just paperwork. It's real people's lives, their hopes, their dreams.
Right, and the officers have to weigh all of that. It's a huge responsibility.
And it doesn't end even when someone gets a TRP. The guides mention something called verification of departure.
Yeah. That's basically a way for the government to make sure that people who were granted TRPs actually leave Canada when they're supposed to. Even after a TRP expires, they can still follow up and make sure the person hasn't overstayed.
So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Nope. And overstaying, even after a TRP, can have serious consequences for any future attempts to come back to Canada.
It really underscores how important it is to respect the system and follow the rules.
Exactly. It's about showing that you're serious about being in Canada and that you're willing to play by the rules.
So we've really dug deep into the world of TRPs. We've seen the process, the conditions, the decision-making, the possibilities, the challenges. It's clear that it's a very complex system with a lot of nuance.
But it's also a system that tries to find a balance between protecting Canada's interests and offering opportunities to people who might not fit the usual mold.
And for our listeners, I hope this deep dive has shed some light on how that balance is achieved. It's not always easy, it's not always perfect, but it's a system that's constantly evolving and adapting to meet the challenges of our time.
And as our listeners continue to explore this topic, maybe they can think about this. Could TRPs, with all their complexities and challenges, actually be a sign of progress, a way for Canada to respond to individual circumstances, to show compassion in a world that's often very rigid and rule-bound?
It's a great question to ponder. And as always, we encourage our listeners to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around them. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.